The rope felt heavier than it should have in Thomas McKenna's weathered hands. 43 years of living had worn him down to nothing more than bones and regret, and now, standing in the musty darkness of his barn, he figured it was time to settle accounts with the world that had taken everything from him. The Montana wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of another lonely winter. His ranch, if you could still call it, that had been dying a slow death for months. The cattle were gone, sold to pay debts that kept multiplying like weeds. His horse, Old Blue, had been the last to go, taken by creditors who didn't care that the animal had been his only companion for the past 5 years. Thomas ran his calloused fingers along the rough hemp, testing its strength. The beam above looked solid enough. Hell, it was probably the only thing on this godforsaken property that hadn't failed him yet. Through the small window, he could see the main house where he'd once dreamed of raising children with Margaret, before the fever took her, before the bank notices started coming, before he'd learned that hope was just another word for foolishness. Should have done this months ago, he muttered to himself, his voice echoing in the empty space where his horses used to rest. The barn still smelled faintly of hay and leather, ghosts of better days that refused to leave him in peace. He'd tied the knot carefully, the way his father had taught him when he was just a boy learning to work cattle. Funny how some skills never left you, even when everything else did. The irony wasn't lost on him, using a cowboy's knot to end a cowboy's life. Standing on the old wooden crate that used to hold Margaret's gardening tools, Thomas slipped the noose around his neck. The hemp scratched against his skin, rough and unforgiving, just like life had been. Through the barn door, left slightly ajar, he could see the last traces of sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, he supposed. A good last thing to see. He closed his eyes and thought of Margaret's laugh, the way she used to hum while cooking breakfast, how she'd insisted on planting flowers around the porch even though they were impractical. Maybe he'd see her again. Maybe there was something after this. Or maybe there was just nothing, which honestly sounded like a mercy. Thomas took a deep breath, ready to step off the crate when a sound made him freeze. It was faint at first, a scratching, scuffling noise coming from the back corner of the barn. Rats, probably. This old place was full of them. But then he heard something else, a whisper. No, not a whisper of voice, small and frightened. Is someone there? Thomas's eyes snapped open. That wasn't a rat, that was a child. He pulled the rope from around his neck with shaking hands and stepped down from the crate, his heart pounding for the first time in months. Who's there? Show yourself. A section of the barn's back wall loose boards he'd been meaning to fix for years shifted slightly, and through the gap emerged the dirtiest, thinnest boy Thomas had ever seen. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his clothes nothing more than rags held together by hope and stubbornness. His dark hair was matted with mud, and his face was gaunt with hunger. Please, mister, the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. We ain't gonna cause no trouble. We just need somewhere to sleep tonight. It's gonna rain something fierce. We? Thomas asked, still in shock. As if summoned by his question, 4 more children emerged from behind the loose boards. A girl who might have been 10, her blonde hair hanging in dirty tangles around her shoulders. Twin boys who looked about 6, holding hands and staring at him with enormous blue eyes. And the smallest one, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4, clutching a doll made from corn husks and string. They stood there like a line of scarecrows, all of them too thin, too dirty, too alone. The kind of children you saw in the aftermath of Indian raids or when homesteads failed and families scattered to the winds. Where did you come from? Thomas asked, his voice gentler now. The oldest boy, clearly their leader, squared his shoulders despite his obvious fear. Our folks died of the consumption last month. Been walking since then, looking for kin or someone who might take us in. Ain't found nobody yet. What are your names? I'm Samuel, the boy said. This here's Mary, He nodded to the blonde girl. "And these are the twins, James and Joseph. The little one's Lucy." Thomas looked at them, these 5 ghosts of children who'd appeared in his barn just as he was about to leave this world forever. Their timing was so impossible, so perfect, that he almost laughed. "Almost. You hungry?" he heard himself ask. Samuel's eyes widened. "Yes, sir. We ain't had nothing but berries and creek water for 2 days." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the barn roof. The children instinctively moved closer together, and Thomas saw Lucy shiver in her threadbare dress. He looked at the rope still hanging from the beam, then back at the 5 pairs of eyes watching him with desperate hope. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of timing. "All right," he said finally, surprising himself with a decision. "You can stay in here tonight. I'll see what I can find for you to eat." The relief that washed over their faces was almost painful to witness. Samuel stepped forward, his young face serious beyond his years. "Thank you, mister. We're real grateful. We'll work for our keep, if you'll have us. I'm strong for my age, and Mary's good with cooking and mending. The twins can gather eggs and such, and Lucy. Well, Lucy's good at being sweet." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. As he turned to leave the barn, Mary spoke up. "Mister, what's your name?" He paused in the doorway, rain beginning to fall harder now. "Thomas McKenna." "Thank you, Mr. McKenna," she said softly. "You're an angel." As Thomas walked through the rain toward his empty house, he couldn't help but think that if there were any angels in this barn tonight, they weren't him. But maybe, just maybe, they had wings too small to see and voices too young to ignore. Thomas McKenna hadn't cooked for anyone but himself in over 2 years, and it showed. The cornbread came out burned on the bottom and raw in the middle. The beans were saltier than the Dead Sea, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. But as he watched 5 pairs of thin hands grab at the food like it was the finest feast in Denver, he realized that maybe hunger was the best seasoning after all. They sat around his kitchen table, a table that had been empty for so long he'd forgotten how small it really was. The children ate in near silence, their manners surprisingly good despite their obvious desperation. Samuel made sure the younger ones got their share before taking his own. Mary helped Lucy cut her cornbread into manageable pieces. The twins, James and Joseph, ate identically as if they shared one stomach between them. "This is real good, mister." "McKenna," Samuel said between bites, though Thomas could see him struggling to chew the burnt edges of the bread. "You don't have to lie, boy. I know it's terrible. Been cooking for one for too long." Thomas poured himself more of the bitter coffee and studied their faces in the lamplight. Up close, cleaned up some with water from his well, they looked even younger than he'd thought, and hungrier. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" Mary looked up from helping Lucy. "Maybe 3 weeks? There was a lady in Billings who gave us some stew, but that was before we had to leave town." "Had to leave? Why?" The children exchanged glances, and Thomas saw fear flicker across their faces. Samuel straightened up, protective instincts kicking in. "Sheriff said orphans brought bad luck. Said we were probably carrying disease. Told us if we didn't move on, he'd have us sent to one of them institutions back east." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. "Institutions?" "Workhouses," Mary whispered. "Places where they separate families. Where they work you till you drop and don't care if you ever see your kin again." The little girl Lucy spoke up for the first time since entering his house. "Samuel promised we'd stay together, no matter what." Her voice was so small, so trusting, that Thomas had to look away. Through his kitchen window, he could see the barn where just hours ago he'd been ready to end everything. Now these children sat at his table, filling his house with something he'd forgotten existed purpose. "Well," he said finally, "I reckon the sheriff in Billings is a fool. You're not going to any institution." "Does that mean we can stay?" James asked. Or maybe it was Joseph. Thomas still couldn't tell them apart. The question hung in the air like smoke from his fireplace. Could they stay? He had barely enough money for himself, and winter was coming. The roof leaked in 3 places, the barn needed repairs, and he hadn't seen a paying job in months. Taking in 5 children wasn't practical. It wasn't smart. It might not even be possible. But as he looked around his table that was finally full again, Thomas realized that practical and smart hadn't gotten him very far. Maybe it was time to try something different. For now, he said. We'll see how it goes. Samuel nodded solemnly, as if he understood exactly what Thomas wasn't saying. We'll earn our keep, Mr. McKenna. You won't regret this. Over the next few days, Thomas discovered that Samuel hadn't been boasting. Despite their size and age, the children worked with a determination that shamed him. Mary proved to be surprisingly skilled at mending, patching holes in his shirts and pants with thread she somehow conjured from scraps. Samuel helped him fix the loose boards on the barn and showed remarkable strength for someone who probably weighed less than a full-grown calf. The twins were natural with animals, coaxing eggs from the few scraggly chickens Thomas still owned and somehow getting more milk from his old cow than he'd managed in weeks. Even little Lucy contributed, gathering kindling and wildflowers that she arranged in jars around the house, bringing color to rooms that had been gray for too long. But it wasn't easy. The first week was full of adjustments that tested everyone's patience. Lucy cried for her mother in the middle of the night, her sobs echoing through the thin walls. The twins got into a fight over the last piece of bread and had to be separated by Samuel, who looked like he wanted to cry himself but held it together for the others. Mary burned dinner trying to cook over an unfamiliar stove, and Thomas snapped at her before immediately feeling like the worst kind of heel. "I'm sorry," he told her later, finding her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the empty pastures. "I didn't mean to raise my voice." "It's all right," she said, but he could hear the hurt in her voice. "We're used to it." That phrase, "we're used to it," hit Thomas harder than any physical blow could have. Used to yelling, used to disappointment, used to being unwanted. What kind of world had these children been living in? "Well, you shouldn't be," he said, sitting down beside her. "You shouldn't be used to any of this." Mary looked at him with eyes that were far too old for her 10-year-old face. "Our pa used to yell when he'd been drinking. And after Ma died, he drank a lot. Samuel would hide us in the cellar when it got bad." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "He hit you?" "Sometimes, but Samuel always tried to get between us and him. That's why Samuel's got that scar on his arm from when Pa threw a bottle." Thomas looked through the kitchen window where he could see Samuel helping the twins with their letters, patiently sounding out words. The boy was 11 years old and already carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Your pa. When he died, ... We were sad," Mary said quietly, "but we were also relieved. Does that make us bad people?" Thomas turned to face her fully, this little girl who'd seen too much and understood too little about why adults failed so completely. "No, sweetheart, that doesn't make you bad people at all." As October turned toward November, the nights grew colder and the children grew more comfortable in their new home. Thomas found himself looking forward to supper conversations, to Lucy's questions about everything from why chickens couldn't fly to whether angels really had wings. He enjoyed teaching James and Joseph to whittle, watching their identical faces scrunch up in concentration as they tried to carve simple horses from pieces of wood. But it was Samuel who surprised him the most. The boy had an old soul and a quick mind, asking thoughtful questions about ranching and listening carefully to Thomas's answers. One evening, as they worked together to repair a section of fence, Samuel spoke up. "Mr. McKenna, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "That rope in the barn, the one with the noose, were you ... were you gonna ... Thomas's hand stilled on the fence post. He'd forgotten about the rope, had meant to take it down, but somehow never got around to it. He looked at Samuel, this boy who'd seen too much already, and realized he deserved honesty. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "I was." Why? The simple question deserved a simple answer, but Thomas found it harder to explain than he'd expected. I lost everything. My wife, my cattle, my hope. Felt like there wasn't any point in going on. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. You still feel that way? Thomas looked around at his property, still run down, still struggling, still barely holding together. But through the kitchen window, he could see Mary helping Lucy with her stitching while the twins played with cornhusk dolls at their feet. The house was warm with lamplight and laughter, full of voices and purpose. No, he said, surprising himself with how quickly and certainly the word came. No, I don't. Good, Samuel said, picking up his hammer again. Because we need you, Mr. McKenna, and I think maybe you need us too. As they worked in companionable silence, Thomas realized that the boy was right. For the first time in years, he was needed. Not for his money or his land or his connections, but for himself. For his patience with Lucy's endless questions. For his steady hands teaching the twins to work with wood. For his willingness to give them a place where being young and scared and hopeful wasn't a crime. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas walked out to the barn. The rope still hung from the beam, swaying slightly in the draft. He stood there for a long moment, remembering the desperation that had driven him to tie that noose, the absolute certainty that there was nothing left worth living for. Then he climbed up on the crate, untied the rope, and threw it in the corner with the rest of the scrap. Some tools, he realized, outlived their usefulness. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance. Thomas woke one morning in mid-November to find frost coating the windows and his breath visible in the bedroom air. With 6 bodies now calling the old house home, staying warm became a daily challenge. We need more firewood, Thomas announced at breakfast, watching the children huddle around their bowls of oatmeal. I can help chop, Samuel offered, though Thomas noticed the boy's lips had a bluish tint. Thomas shook his head. You kids focus on keeping the house warm. I'll handle the wood. But when he examined his wood pile, he realized he had barely enough seasoned logs to last 2 weeks. The children had needs he'd never considered: growing bodies that needed warmth, young lungs that couldn't handle smoke from green wood. That afternoon, he hitched up his wagon and made the trip into town, hoping to find work or trade labor for firewood. Outside McGinty's general store, a familiar voice called his name. Tom McKenna. Well, I'll be damned. Thomas turned to see Jake Morrison approaching, a man he'd known back when both their ranches were thriving. Jake looked prosperous: new coat, unscuffed boots, wagon loaded with supplies. Jake, Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of his own patched jacket. Heard you've taken in some orphans. 5 of them? Thomas stiffened. What of it? Easy there, Tom. I admire it. Most folks wouldn't take on that responsibility when they're struggling themselves. Jake glanced at Thomas's nearly empty wagon. What brings you to town? Thomas explained the firewood situation. Jake listened without interrupting. Tell you what, Jake said. I've got more firewood than I need, and I could use an extra hand with repairs before the worst weather hits. You work for me for a week, and I'll send you home with enough seasoned wood to last the winter. It was too generous, but Thomas had 5 children depending on him now. Deal, Thomas said, extending his hand. Good man. Bring the boy, Samuel, is it? Could use another pair of hands, and I'll pay him too. That evening, Thomas explained the arrangement to the children. Samuel's face lit up at earning money, but Mary looked worried. What if someone comes asking questions about us? You hide in the root cellar like we practiced and wait for me to come home, Thomas promised. What if you don't come home? Lucy asked, her small voice cutting through the room. Thomas knelt beside Lucy's chair and took her tiny hands. I'll always come home. That's a promise. The work at Jake's ranch was hard but honest. Samuel threw himself into the labor, and Thomas was proud to see Jake treat the boy with respect. That's a good kid you've got there, Jake said, watching Samuel work. Smart as a whip. "He's not mine by blood," Thomas replied, then paused. The words felt wrong. Jake looked at him with amusement. "Tom, blood's got nothing to do with it. That boy looks at you like you hung the moon. That's not charity, friend. That's family. Family." The word echoed in Thomas's mind. When he and Samuel returned home each evening, they were greeted with lamplight and whatever Mary had cooked. Lucy would run to Thomas with arms outstretched. The twins would compete to tell him about their day. It felt like coming home to something he'd never had, even during his marriage. These children filled empty spaces in his heart he hadn't known existed. On Friday evening, Jake loaded Thomas's wagon with enough firewood to last the winter, plus extra blankets for the children. The ride home was cold but cheerful, with Samuel chattering about everything he'd learned. Thomas found himself actually smiling for the first time in months. But as they approached the house, Thomas noticed something wrong. No smoke from the chimney, dark windows. His heart raced as he urged the horses faster. The front door stood wide open, moving in the wind. Thomas leaped from the wagon. "Mary, children!" No answer. They searched quickly empty. No signs of struggle, but no children either. "Mr. McKenna." Samuel's voice came from outside. "I found them." Samuel pointed toward the root cellar. Thomas could hear faint whispers below ground. He knocked on the wooden door. "It's me. It's Thomas. You can come out now." The door opened slowly, and Mary's tear-stained face appeared. "Mr. McKenna, is it really you?" As the children climbed out, Mary explained. Two men had come claiming to be from the territorial government, looking for orphan children for institutions. "They pounded on the door for near an hour," Mary said, shaking. "But we stayed quiet, just like you told us." Thomas felt rage and fear warring in his chest. Someone wanted to take his children away. Did they say when they'd be back? "Tomorrow," Mary whispered. "With the sheriff." Thomas looked at the 5 frightened faces, Samuel trying to be brave, Lucy clutching her cornhusk doll. These children had found safety here, maybe for the first time in their lives. "All right," he said, voice steady despite the turmoil. "Then we'd better be ready for them." Thomas spent that night pacing the kitchen floor, alternating between fury and panic. By dawn, he'd worn a path in the floorboards but still didn't have a plan. The children woke early, sensing the tension. They moved quietly through their morning routines, speaking in whispers and glancing toward the windows. "Mr. McKenna," Samuel said over breakfast, "what can we do? They're government men. They got the law on their side." "I won't let them take you," Thomas said firmly. "I'll figure something out." Around mid-morning, Thomas heard approaching hoofbeats. His blood ran cold until he recognized Jake Morrison's Mara. Jake rode up with another man well-dressed, with the bearing of authority. "Tom," Jake called out, dismounting. "This here's Judge William Harrison from Helena. Asked him to ride out and have a word with you." Judge Harrison stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mr. McKenna, Jake tells me you've taken in some orphan children." Thomas shook the judge's hand warily. "That's right. He also tells me there may be complications regarding their placement. If you're here to take them away, you'll have a fight." Judge Harrison smiled slightly. "Actually, I'm here to prevent that. May I speak with the children?" Confused but hopeful, Thomas called them out. They emerged slowly, staying close together. Judge Harrison knelt to their level. "I understand you've been living with Mr. McKenna. Are you happy here?" The children nodded solemnly. Lucy stepped forward fearlessly. "He's nice to us. He don't yell, and he makes sure we got food." "And he's teaching us to read," added Mary. Judge Harrison nodded, making notes. "And you'd like to stay here, all of you?" "Yes, sir," Samuel said firmly. "We're a family now." The judge looked up at Thomas. "And you? Do you want these children to stay?" Thomas looked down at the 5 faces. Samuel trying to be brave, Mary protective, the twins holding hands, Lucy clutching her doll. How could he explain what they meant to him? "Yes," he said simply. I want them to stay. Judge Harrison closed his notebook. Jake, would you mind watching the children? I'd like to speak with Mr. McKenna privately. They walked away from the house, and the judge got straight to the point. The men who came yesterday aren't from the territorial government. They're bounty hunters who collect orphans and deliver them to institutions back east for profit. Thomas felt sick. They're stealing children? Essentially, yes. But I can stop them. You've been caring for these children for 2 months, providing shelter, food, education. That makes you their de facto guardian, and I can make it official. Legal guardianship? Exactly. It would make it impossible for anyone to remove them without just cause. The judge paused. But you need to understand this comes with serious responsibilities. You'd be obligated to provide for their needs until they reach adulthood. Judge, Thomas interrupted, I don't have much money. But I've got 2 hands, willingness to work, and love for those children. If that's enough, let's do it. That's more than enough. And Jake's prepared to offer you steady employment. They walked back toward the house. There's one more thing, the judge said quietly. The children's surname. I could arrange for them to take your name as part of the process. It would give them a fresh start. The idea of these children carrying his name was overwhelming. What do they want? Let's ask them. They explained the situation, legal guardianship, the name change, what it meant. The children listened seriously. So we'd really be a family? Legal and everything? Samuel asked. Legal and everything, the judge confirmed. Samuel looked at his siblings. Some silent communication passed between them. We want to stay. We want to be McKenna's. The paperwork took several hours. While Judge Harrison worked, Jake helped arrange the firewood properly. The twins chattered excitedly about their new names, while Mary helped Lucy understand what was happening. As the sun set, Judge Harrison and Jake prepared to leave. The documents were signed and sealed. Thomas McKenna was now legal guardian of 5 children who officially bore his name. The bounty hunters will probably return, Judge Harrison warned. Show them these papers. They have no legal standing now. After the visitors left, Thomas found himself with his newly official family. They sat around their table sharing dinner. Mr. McKenna, Lucy said, are you our papa now? The question silenced the table. Thomas looked around at the 5 faces watching him, his children now, legally and in every way that mattered. If you want me to be, he said softly. We do, Samuel said firmly. We want you to be our papa. Thomas felt tears threaten, good tears, tears of joy and overwhelming love for these children who had saved him from darkness. Then that's what I am, your papa. That night, Thomas walked out to the barn one more time. He looked up at the beam where the rope had hung just months ago when he'd been ready to end everything. Now the barn was full of winter fodder and the house echoed with children's laughter. He thought about Margaret, and for the first time since her death, the memory didn't bring crushing sadness. She would have approved of the family he'd found. Tomorrow he would start his job with Jake. The children would continue their lessons. They would face whatever challenges came, winter storms, struggles, growing pains, but they would face them together. Thomas McKenna was no longer a man with nothing left to lose. He was a father with everything to protect. And for the first time in years, he was excited to see what tomorrow would bring. As he walked toward the house, he could see warm light in the windows and hear his family settling for the night. 5 children who had started as strangers needing shelter had become the reason he got up every morning. Sometimes the best things in life came when you were too busy saving others to realize they were saving you right back. And sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. Behind him, the barn stood ready for winter. Ahead, the house waited with warmth and love and the promise of tomorrow. Thomas McKenna had found his way home.